Do you feel your potential calling you, but also feel held back by fear of failure? You're cautious, you're careful, but no matter how hard you try, you keep making awful mistakes, which makes you afraid to go after what you want because disappointment is always around the corner. This can cause people to spend years on the sidelines, never really going after what they want in life. If you don't overcome this, you're never going to achieve what you want, and you won't fulfill your potential. There's actually a good explanation for this, and there's a solution. By the end of this video, you will learn how to remove unneeded fear so you can access more of your potential. When you do, the likelihood of your success in any area of your life is going to go way up. It takes understanding fear and how it affects the way you think. In addition to being a great alert system that keeps you out of harm's way and keeps you from taking risks without considering the possible consequences, fear is actually a type of focus. Stay with me on this, because once you understand this, you'll never look at fear the same way again. Anytime you focus, it requires that you narrow your perspective. This ability is part of our intelligence and helps us to block out distractions while we give greater attention to something that requires intense focus, like performing surgery or playing a musical instrument. Fear is required for our survival, and it helps us in decision making, unless, instead of being part of the discussion, it becomes your focus. Fear narrows our focus to detect dangers, but in doing so, we give up access to internal resources. Now, this is not a bad thing. Anytime we narrow our focus and we're in control of it, we intentionally give up access to other parts of ourselves that are unnecessary for what we're focusing on in the moment. We utilize only the resources necessary to execute the function we're performing. Not only does this keep us from being distracted, it's also a very efficient way to use energy. For example, a sense of humor is considered an internal resource, but a surgeon doesn't need to access their sense of humor in order to perform an effective surgery. A musician will need to access his or her creativity, which is a resource, but it would likely be unnecessary for them to access a resource like tenacity. As soon as we don't need to focus any longer, we can open our perspective and regain access to any of our resources. This is an effective and efficient use of our ability to focus. But when it comes to fear, it gets a little tricky. Given the emotional aspect of fear, it can be very difficult to maintain your perspective when you experience fear. Remember, fear is a type of focus, and this is very useful as long as we don't let it take control of us. However, when you don't understand this, you're likely to allow fear to narrow your perspective so much that you can't access the resources you need to access in order to deal with the situation you're in. The result is that your fear becomes a hyper-focus, and it can feel paralyzing, like it is in control of you instead of the other way around. Without access to the necessary resources, it's very difficult to make good decisions. This is why we're always told never to panic in a crisis, and it's also exactly why we panic in a crisis. Loss of access to our internal resources is frightening and creates more fear, which causes more loss of internal resources, which then leads to panic. It becomes a loop that just gets worse and worse if you don't understand what's happening. What you can do is stop, relax, breathe. Another thing that fear does, in addition to narrowing our focus, is it tends to narrow our focus on what we fear might happen. If we're afraid of giving a public talk, for example, because we might screw up, we think a lot about screwing up. You probably see yourself in front of everyone making mistakes and feeling embarrassed. Even though you're telling yourself to not do that, what you're actually doing is focusing on it and even rehearsing the very thing you fear you will do. You're rehearsing this over and over in your mind. And the result is that you make those exact same mistakes. So the simple solution to this, when your fears come up, is to pay attention to your internal representations that trigger that fear. Most of you will see images and movies of what you fear happening. Some of you will hear voices and sounds, and some of you might even feel tactile or proprioceptive sensations, or perhaps you'll have combinations of 2 or 3 of these. For most people, they don't even know this is happening. It's completely, or maybe even partially, unconscious. When you start to notice these things, however, and make it conscious, it will put you into what we call a meta position, where you're stepping back and observing what's happening rather than being swallowed by the fear. This will give you some welcome relief. Now ask yourself, what do you want to happen instead, rather than what you fear will happen? This is an absolute game changer. This will cause your mind to have to come up with internal representations of the outcomes you want to happen, replacing the internal representations of what you fear will happen. Instead of seeing yourself fumbling through a public speech and people laughing at you, you see yourself looking confident and performing at your best to an engaged audience. Rehearse this in your mind. Hear the sounds and voices of what a great performance would be like. What does it feel like in your body when you do this? It's okay to acknowledge your fears. It's okay to give fear a seat at the table in the conversations you have with yourself. Like I said, fear is a great warning system, but it's a terrible leader. Stay focused on what you want instead of what you don't want, and you'll make great choices and you'll make great decisions, and you won't be afraid to take action. Now, don't let the simplicity of what I just shared with you keep you from recognizing how much this will help you. In fact, right now I will take a moment to introduce you to a client of mine who has experienced my personal guidance through change techniques just like this.
I, before would never consider myself to be creative. And anytime that I was creative or somebody said, oh, that was really creative, I just kind of ignored it, nah, that's not me. And now after working with Damon, now I'm continuously noticing and smiling at times when I'm oh, that was really creative. Look what I just pulled off there. And then I'm also noticing when I get that feedback from other people, oh, that was really creative. How did you come up with that? And it's before I wouldn't have even noticed, but now when I'm hearing that, I'm oh yeah, that was really creative. I love it. I mean, I'm sure they've heard this before, but everything truly is internal. We spend a lot of time focusing on the external things, but when you really realize that you do have everything that you want or desire, within, and you just need to essentially figure out a way to access it, or figure out, Damon does a really great job of giving analogies, almost like showing the brain as a computer and how we go through things. When I first worked with Damon, the choice was to buy a third of a Bitcoin or to work with Damon, and I'm still happy to this day, now that even though that Bitcoin is significantly appreciated past that, I'm still glad that I chose to work with him. So yeah, for me, it was a no-brainer. It's an obvious investment in yourself. And obviously if you're, knowing that you're worth it, knowing that you're worth the investment, then it's why wouldn't you do it?
If you would like to take this further and learn how to make even better choices and decisions, you'll want to learn how to elicit your values. It's super, super important to be able to know how to do this and make your values conscious. How do you elicit your values? You're in luck. I have a PDF that shows you exactly how to do it. All you have to do is fill in the blanks. It's the exact same PDF that my students use to learn how to transform themselves at the identity level. You can access the PDF by going to the description below and clicking that link, and then I'll email it right to you. Now that you've made it this far, that can only mean one thing. It means you want to learn more. And I have got the best next video for you. Check it out, it's right here.